Guys, thanks for joining us today. My name is Jacob, located at HireTech down in Houston, and Mike has joined me here today. And I will talk about grants or payroll tax credit, which non-dilutive funding source is most attractive for your life science startup. I will start with an overview of grants. I will go into a high-level comparison of grants versus the R&D tax credit. Then I'll provide more details about the R&D tax credit and the payroll version of that tax credit specifically. And then we will have time for Q&A, although feel free to interrupt me and ask any questions that you have during the presentation. Throughout the presentation, I will refer to this as taxable income versus time plot, with taxable income or TI on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And as a life science startup, you're probably well aware that a lot of times you're on this left side of the curve for several years where you have net operating losses, but then hopefully eventually you get to this side where you actually have taxable income. For grants, it does not matter what side of that graph you're on, you can qualify for grants. The top 4 reasons to apply for grants: number 1, it's not a loan, you never have to repay it. Number 2, it's non-dilutive. You don't give up any equity, you don't have to worry about a cap table like you would after some of these meetings here if you're successful. Number 3, you don't give up intellectual property or your IP. And number 4, it provides valuable recognition, verification, and visibility for your company, because if you get a federal grant, you can put that on your website and say, not only did experts in my field evaluate my project and think it was innovative, but the federal government looked at my company and thought it was worthy of federal funds. And that can help with investor funding, essentially. So which grants should you go after? There's literally tens to hundreds depending on your topic. So it's very important to choose your battles wisely, because you don't want to have to compete against MD Anderson, Harvard, University of California, because they have researchers there where it's their job to write grants, receive grants, write journal articles, and then repeat that entire process. And you don't want to have to compete against those people. So fortunately for you, there's the Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR, and Small Business Technology Transfer, or STTR program. And what this is a federal program where it eliminates that competition from the research institutions, and only other small businesses can apply for it. Not only that, but it specifically funds research and development, or R&D, that has the potential for commercialization. And how this works is, if you're a federal agency that spends a certain amount of funding on R&D, you're required to have an SBIR and sometimes an STTR program. For eligibility, you must be for-profit, located in the U.S., and have less than 500 employees. For the ownership, it must be more than 50% owned by U.S. individuals. But note that the National Institutes of Health, which I'll focus on that for this presentation since that's most applicable, the NIH for SBIRs, they allow you to be more than 50% owned by multiple VCs rather than by individuals. Yes?
For U.S. individuals, can you give a clarification on that? Like if you hold a green card, do you consider as U.S. individuals?
So it's U.S. individuals or permanent resident alien. So, which I think that is green card, correct?
Yeah.
So, yes, it's either of those. Yep. Good question. So, for facilities and team, for an SBIR, at least 67% of the funding in the work must go through your small business and your facilities. And also, your principal investigator or your PI must be at least 50% employed by your small business. For the STTR, it's basically the exact same program as an SBIR, but it has a mandated partnership with a research institution. In this case, at least 40% must go through your small business, and at least 30% must go through that research institution. And also in this case, NIH allows your PI to be employed at that research institution, which is great as a virtual small business, because then you can have a PI that's a university professor to boost your investigator score without having to hire away that person from the university, which can be difficult to do.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Does university investigator has to hold some shares for the small business, or does it matter?
No, there's no requirement for ownership or anything like that. It could be, it is required that you have,
Collaboration.
yeah, you have to have some type of agreement in place, but it doesn't have to be an equity agreement. It can just be a work agreement or contractor agreement. So the review process and success rates for this, it's important to understand that to understand whether or not you should go after them. So most reviewers are professors. Even though it's a small business grant, it's difficult to get a bunch of small business people to review these grants because that's taken away from their time. But professors, they're expected to volunteer and review these grants. So what they do is they review them all, and basically the cream of the crop, the top 15 to 20% gets funded. These reviewers decide that based off 5 NIH criteria. Number 1 is significance. How important is it to the field? How much of a public health impact will it make? Number 2, investigators, like we discussed just a minute ago. Do you have PhDs on your team, MDs? Does your team have patents or business experience that suggests that if they give you this money, it will eventually turn into a product and create jobs in the U.S., which is the ultimate goal of this program? Number 3, innovation. Can you differentiate it from what is out on the market? And can you differentiate it from what is currently in the works by other companies? Maybe other companies have grants for a similar topic. Can you differentiate from them? Number 4 is approach. Are your methods logical and are they backed by science? Are they backed? Can you refer to journal articles that suggest it's the right thing to do? And then finally, you propose an approach, but do you have the facilities and do your collaborators have the facilities to execute it? If you propose to do animal imaging, do you have access to MRI equipment to do that imaging? So before applying, you should look at all these criteria and consider, is my project and my team among the best? Is it in that cream of the crop area? And one way you can do this is you can use NIH Reporter, which is a tool where you can search for awarded abstracts and compare for your topic and see, number 1, have you been scooped? And number 2, is it along those lines where you're innovative and it's something NIH would want to fund? These SBIRs, STTRs are set up in 2 phases. Phase 1 is typically up to 1 year, up to $225,000, and it's proving feasibility of your project. If you prove feasibility, then you can apply for a phase 2, where you continue the R&D and keep pushing it towards commercialization. Phase 2 is typically up to $1.5 million spread over 2 years. And note that NIH, they had direct to phase 2, then they didn't have it, but they recently brought it back. So if you have enough data that suggests you completed phase 1 with your own funding, you can jump to the phase 2 and the big money and apply for that. NIH also has a fast track option where you can apply for a phase 1 and a phase 2 at the same time. Finally, after you get past phase 2, they expect you to commercialize and again create U.S. jobs and make a lot of money, hopefully. Yes?
Is gap years allowed from phase 1 to phase 2, or you have to be conservative?
Say that again? Is there?
The gap year between phase 1 and phase 2, do you allow some time to make phase 2 application stronger after you finish the phase 1?
Well, so phase 1, they're completely separate if you apply phase 1.
1 year, right? After you finish the first 1.
Well, it depends. Like, let's say you do a phase 1 year study. If you get your results early, you could theoretically apply for phase 2 early. But then you're right that it typically...
If I have something else to do.
Yes. Because even like from when you apply, and we're actually going to cover this in the next slide, so maybe, here we go. Let me just cover this. So
Sure.
let's say this is an April 5th deadline, a first submission. So this person here is looking forward because grants fund something you will complete in the future. And so you need at least 2 months to submit. You submit it, it goes to that critical review or scientific review that I mentioned. They score it. If you're in the top 50%, you get scored, and then it goes to the advisory council round, and they identify the threshold on who gets funded. And then, if you're fortunate enough, 6 to 8 months from when you apply is when you first see those funds. And so again, if you're doing that phase 1 there, and then you apply, it's 6 to 8 months from when you apply to when you get that money for the phase 2. Okay? Let's say you don't get it on the first try. You get the scientific review back, it has the critiques in it, you could respond to that. They give you another section, a 1-page introduction section where you could say, here's what we did to change this or address this. You resubmit it, it's reviewed again, goes to the advisory council again. In this case, it could be 12 to 14 months from when you first apply to when you get that resubmission funded. All right, so that's high level on grants. Here's the one-to-one comparison for the R&D tax credit. For the R&D tax credit, historically, you had to have taxable income, and you had to have a certain level of taxable income to be able to benefit, because previously you could only use it to offset corporate income taxes. As of 2016, you no longer need taxable income. As long as you have people on the payroll, you're paying payroll taxes, and you can use this to offset payroll taxes. Top 3 reasons to go after this credit are very similar to grants. It's not a loan, it's non-dilutive, you don't lose your IP. But you don't have that same recognition there at the bottom, because the eligibility for this is much different than grants. Eligibility here is determined by gross receipts and qualifying research expenditures, or QREs, which I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute here. But essentially, unlike those SBIR programs and projects, your R&D can be from any technology sector. It doesn't have to be life science. We have machine shops that would qualify because a part of their work is considered R&D by the IRS definition. And then also, it can be the most boring incremental research you've ever seen. It doesn't matter. As long as it meets the IRS definition of R&D, it's okay. You don't have to impress these professors who are in the field and they know what innovation is. You don't have to do that. It doesn't have to be new to the world. You just have to impress the IRS agent, which that's not hard to do. You just need to follow the instructions, right? But I say that it's not hard to do if you know the rules. And HireTech was founded based off that if, because we help these companies determine what qualifies and why it qualifies. But if you know what you're doing, you know how to qualify it. It's 100% hit rate if you know what you're doing. Yes?
Do you suggest to have some professionals, tax credit professionals do this, or we just do ourselves?
I mean, if you have a CFO that knows what he or she is doing, then sure. If they're familiar with the credit, sure. But if you don't, then that's what
I guess
HireTech.
my question is, if it's worse to hire somebody that's doing it for us small companies.
Is it, say it again? Is it?
It's worse to hire some professional in order to get successful.
So,
If financially makes sense to do that.
yeah,
And for startup a company, as you know, it's usually just 2 or 3 people.
right,
And,
right.
we are very scarce in the hands.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk afterwards. I mean, that's like a business decision, but essentially, like what we do, you know, we determine, we have attorneys on the team, we help determine what actually qualifies and what does not. And then also we have audit defense, which is included. So if you were to do it on your own and then you get audited, then you would need somebody to help do the audit defense for you also.
Right.
So it's just something to consider. We can talk after it also.
Sure.
So then, what's the timeline here? I showed it for grants earlier. So we're about to finish 2018. We got just less than 2 months left. So we have 2018 on the left. And let's assume a standard like S-Corp where you file March 15th. And this is an example for companies with taxable income, okay? So this may not apply to startups, but essentially this person here, instead of looking forward like grants, you look backwards at R&D you have worked on in the past tax year. Once you file it in March 15, you get immediate tax savings, like a personal tax return. If you have a credit, you get immediate savings on your taxes for that year. For the other example, if you don't have corporate income taxes, you still file on March 15th, you still look backwards at R&D you have worked on, but in this case you don't have taxes to offset, so what the IRS allows you to do now is to begin offsetting payroll taxes starting the quarter after you file. So if you filed in Q1, you start offsetting payroll taxes in Q2. So high-level overview, and then again, I'll go into more details on the tax credit, but grants, it's 15 to 20% success rate. It's judged by professors. R&D tax credit is near 100% and is judged by IRS rules. Grants are forward-looking at projects you will complete. R&D is backward-looking at projects you've already worked on. Grants, it takes 6 to 10 months from when you apply to when you first see the funding. R&D tax credit is 0 to 3 months. It's either immediately or 3 months after filing. Amount, grants can be up to 1.5 million typically. R&D tax credit is 8 to 12% of your qualifying R&D can be a tax credit. So before going into more detail, you should do both if you're a good candidate for both. They're both non-dilutive funding, they're both very attractive.
Is there a cap for the IRS for the R&D tax credit?
There is, yes. Good. It's $250,000 per year for the payroll part of it. For the regular one, it's unlimited.
Okay.
So that tax credit back to the company, right?
Yes, yes. Back to yes.
So there's nothing to do with individual. Let's say I have income tax from the company.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the regular one, if it's a flow-through S corp, you apply the taxes, but the company isn't taxed. It flows through to the owners.
Right.
So you flow that credit to the owners. The payroll tax credit, you pay that as you pay your employees. It doesn't go through to you. And so it's separate from the ownership. It doesn't matter what the owners are.
Okay, so it's
Yeah.
two.
Yes, it's two. It's in that sense, it's two separate ways of applying it. Yes, that's correct. All right, so R&D tax credit, the goal when it was created to keep innovation and creativity in the U.S., encourage economic growth, just like I mentioned for grants, the same goals. They want to build the U.S. economy, create more jobs. And the benefit is a tax credit if your company performed R&D. Just very brief history, started in 1981. It would expire like several years. Was it every year for a stretch? And so then Congress would have to backtrack and say, okay, retroactive, it's here again. And it used to be more like grants where it had to be new to the world R&D. But they also changed that in around 2000, 2001, I think, where they said, no, it doesn't have to be new to the world, it just has to be R&D. So the changes I talked about happened in 2015 because of the PATH Act, and then it was implemented in 2016. So here's the three big changes because of the PATH Act. Number one, it made the R&D tax credit permanent for the first time, so that you didn't have to, it didn't expire, then retroactively have to apply it. Number two, if you did have taxable income of any sort, you could claim the credit against alternative minimum tax, which I'll go over in a minute here. And then number three is the main one. The startups can claim up to $250,000 of the credit against payroll tax. So very briefly on each one of these, it's now permanent. So now these companies with taxable income can budget for that instead of having it being a question mark of will they renew it again or not. So the second part of that, the AMT, just really quick on what AMT is. These are two scenarios, two different companies for regular tax liability here. So what the government does is they set a tentative minimum tax where if you pay below that tax, you have to pay additional tax called AMT. So the previous R&D credit, it can only be taken on this amount above this TMT level. What the PATH Act did is it marked out that TMT. It said that does not apply for this specific credit. So now instead of just taking it on this portion, you can take it on almost all of the taxes, the tax liability. For this case, your company must have average annual gross receipts of less than $50 million, but if you meet that, which most do, you can offset any type of tax. And so I mentioned that plot earlier, so I'm going to explain these changes based off that plot. This was the old rule. You had to be above this AMT level. That second area I just talked about was this part right here. Previously, these guys could not qualify, but now they can. You can offset these taxes also.
So Jacob, is this specific for S Corp or C Corp is included?
Everybody, everybody. So then now, the last part of this is where life science startups come into play mostly. Because you're in this NOL range, net operating loss, and you can use it to offset payroll taxes. So again, for the first time ever, you can use it to offset payroll taxes. Here's the eligibility criteria. The current year, so if we're looking at 18, you must have gross receipts of less than 5 million. It gets a little bit tricky because sometimes your grants, if you receive grants, that can be considered gross receipts by the IRS definition. And you can't have gross receipts before a 5 taxable year period ending with the current year. So 2018, that's the first year. 17, 16, 15, 14. If you have gross receipts in 13, you're not eligible to take the payroll tax credit. 14, you're fine, okay? Benefit, like I mentioned earlier, you can take this credit starting the quarter after you file to offset payroll taxes. $250,000 per year. If you guys ever looked at the Form 6765, basically they just added a section here where you have to check a box and elect this payroll tax credit. Then, on a quarterly basis, you file payroll taxes via 941. So there's an additional form here where you add your credit. And so if you have a payroll provider, basically you provide them this 8974 with the credit, and they apply it on a quarterly basis. So what qualifies as R&D? Like I mentioned, it's different than the grants definition. It's basically a 4-part test where it has to be a new or improved business component. It has to have technical uncertainty, has to have a process of experimentation, and it has to be technological in nature. It has to be based on the hard sciences, essentially. So if your project passes that 4-part test, then you can take wages, you can take contractor costs, and you can take supply costs as your qualifying research expenditures. In terms of wages, it's typically salaries. It's your W-2 Box 1 wages is what qualifies for this. Plus, there's some other earnings that can qualify, but you have to exclude fringe benefits and 401k type payments. For supplies, it's basically anything that's not equipment that's used and consumed in the R&D process. For life sciences, this can be lab animals, reagents, drugs, supply costs for prototypes if you're a medical device life science company. Then, like I mentioned earlier, you can qualify contractor costs. So 65% of contract research can be qualified in this case. So some examples is startups oftentimes you don't have full-time employees, so you'll hire 1099 workers and pay them hourly to do some R&D. So those types of costs can qualify. But it depends on the contract with those consultants or with those contractors. And so that's one of the things that HireTech does is analyze those contracts and make sure they qualify. The tax credit amount, there's 2 different methods to calculate this credit. It ends up being about 10% for startups in our experience for the regular method, and 8 to 12% of the simplified method. So of QRE, so of wages, so just, real quick example, 100,000 of wages, so it'd be a $10,000 credit if all of that was spent on R&D. And we've had clients that they'll max it out at the $250,000. And a lot of times it's because they have, $2 million in payroll plus a lot of money also going to outsource clinical trial costs, something like that. So something to consider is carry forward. One big thing for these life science companies is net operating loss. So you have net operating loss in these years here, which you can carry forward to offset your taxable income in future years when you eventually become profitable. So the regular credit, like I mentioned before, it offsets that taxable income. So you may not need the regular credit for many years if this NOL offsets many years of taxable income. So if you get that regular R&D tax credit, you can carry forward that credit for 20 years. For the startup version that we're talking about that offsets payroll taxes, you can carry that forward indefinitely. So that's a very attractive feature of the payroll tax credit. All right, this is the last part before the Q&A, but again, ask questions as needed during. But I will go over some examples of common life science startups and tell you if they're qualified, and then tell you what proportion of that is actually qualified research expenditures, and give you an approximate credit amount. So first example, preclinical stage, doing animal research, but they're doing all R&D all the time. Founded in 2013, they have payroll of $242,000, supply costs of $8,000, no gross receipts. They do qualify based off our previous definition. For those that just joined, you must have less than $5 million in gross receipts in the current tax year, and you can't have gross receipts for more than 5 years, essentially. So in this case, all payroll is qualified because even though they have a CEO, they're doing research all the time. They're not doing fundraising or anything. They have a lab tech that also assists with the experiments, and all the supplies are qualified because all of them go directly towards that R&D. In this case, the FICA taxes are around $15,000. The R&D tax credit is $25,000. So this example is more than a year of payroll taxes are offset by this payroll tax credit. Next example is digital health. It's R&D, but they're faster moving because they don't do these animal studies or anything else. They just got to get on those computers and start burning and churning, I guess. So founded in 2014, payroll of $1 million. They had gross receipts of $50,000 to $500,000 for 3 years. Then they had over $5 million in 2017 and $4.2 million in 2018. So again, you can't have more than $5 million, but you can't have it in the current tax year. So they still qualify because they have less than $5 million in the current year. And let's look at that 5-year window, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14. So they had gross receipts in 14, but that's still in that 5-year window. So this is the last year they can qualify is 2018 tax year. So in this case, only 75% of their payroll qualifies because even though they have programmers that are working on R&D all the time, their CEO is going to Resi and doing fundraising and things like that, which you have to exclude from the qualification. They also have an administrative assistant that does not assist with R&D, so we exclude that. In this case, again, it's more than a year of payroll tax credit that offsets more than a year of payroll taxes, essentially. So $75,000 for $62,000 of taxes. Third example is a company that's working on basically clinical trials. So it's R&D approaching commercialization. Founded in 2009, payroll of $1 million, and they outsource $500,000 of contractor costs. They have no gross receipts, so they're eligible. Even though they were founded in 2009, been around almost 10 years, it's okay, they qualify. In this case, 70% of their payroll qualifies because they're doing R&D for their first and second pipeline drugs, and they can qualify all of that, but have to exclude sales and business development because that's not R&D. For the contractor costs, only 50% qualifies because you can qualify the hourly contractors working on R&D, but you must exclude lawyer and consultant fees if it's not specifically guiding your R&D projects. So, for example, if you say, hey, help me file this IP, that's not R&D. If you say, hey, help me file this FDA regulatory stuff, that's not R&D. But if that lawyer or that consultant says, hey, I think you should do these experiments to try to claim this in your patent, or you should do these experiments to try to help get approval by FDA, that part would qualify. Okay.
Like the writing patent, it would be considered as a R&D.
If it's just writing a patent, it would not qualify. But if it's saying you should do these experiments to eventually get this IP, then that would qualify.
What about work on a collaboration, a research R&D collaboration agreement? Would that qualify?
That depends on the agreement. So
If the agreement qualifies.
if the agreement qualifies, so what are you working on? Like what type of R&D? Is it?
Say it's therapeutic development, small molecule discovery.
Yes, so that would qualify assuming that the contract qualifies. The way the contract was written, it qualifies.
Okay.
Yep. All right,
There will be
so,
no clear cut, how can you define those percentage? Right, how much time you spend on R&D, how much time you spend on
yeah,
other functions?
so that's a good question. And so how that would work is, again, this is something you've done in the previous year. So you would have to, I'll just say how we do it is we interview and we say, okay, what projects were you working on first of all? And so we separate qualified from non-qualified projects. And then you can kind of parse it out from there, like, okay, what percentage was on actually doing the research versus like ordering supplies or like dealing with contractors or something like that. But some companies, like if you get an SBIR, you have to track your time, it's a requirement. And so those companies that track their time, we can sometimes do it that way, is parse out the percentages that way. Yeah, this is definitely oversimplified. All right, so this example is the exact same as the previous one. 1 million payroll, founded 09, outsourced contractor costs of 500,000. The only difference is they had gross receipts in 2009. So let's say that was a grant. Again, I mentioned a grant could be considered gross receipts. So let's say they got a grant, didn't have any gross receipts after that. Unfortunately, they would not qualify because that 1 year of gross receipts is outside that 5-year window, and that would exclude them from the payroll tax credit. They could still claim the R&D regular tax credit, but until you have corporate income taxes, you won't be able to benefit. All right, last example here. Let's say your company has SBIRs and you're founded in 2015, no gross receipts, so you qualify. What you do in this case is you only qualify the payroll that is not funded by SBIRs, because you can't double dip. You can't get grant funding and say that also qualifies for R&D payroll. So even though this company, the startup, has 100% committed to R&D, we qualify 60% because 40%, 200,000, is funded by an SBIR. Okay? But in this case, so it's a little bit less than the payroll taxes per the year, but it's still almost offsetting the whole year of payroll taxes. All right, so that brings us to the end. Again, we're HireTech. We're located in Houston. My name's Jacob, and Mike's here with me also. We have a table out in between the posters out there, and I think Mike's might have met with one or two, maybe? Or did they leave already?
No, they left.
Okay.
We had meetings.
But yeah, feel free to come by if you, or do you have any other questions now?
Yeah, I do like to sit down with you to figure out if you would qualify for.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can do it real quick and
Okay.
let you know.
I can tell you what the situation we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we do have SBI agreements, but it's in past, it's only, it's last year,
Last year. So 2017?
2016 and 17.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, if you have payroll in 18 this year, it sounds like it was not funded by R&D. But if you're doing R&D now, then yeah, it sounds like you should have some that qualify.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Any other questions, guys?
So question for you about your business model. Do you guys work on a consulting fee for service basis, or do you work on a percentage of the tax credit? How do you guys work?
So typically it's still hourly capped at a percentage, right? So how we work is we don't charge until the company gets a benefit, because we know that startups are cash strapped. It doesn't make sense to charge a retainer, and especially if nothing ever comes from the credit. Like we may do in some cases we calculate the credit and it's so small it's not worth it to even go after.
That's actually my.
Is that your fear?
It's supposed to have you guys, so it's really thanks.
Yeah, so we'll do that. If it's not big enough, then the company isn't charged anything. But if we go through and we find a credit for the company, in that case, that's when we start charging. And again, it's hourly capped at a percentage. Yeah.
What is the ballpark for percentage?
Mike?
It depends, we'll have to talk. Yeah, it depends, I mean, there's different scenarios on the fees. There are scenarios where a company doesn't know what's there. Like, if you have no idea, is it gonna be $5 or $50,000, right? So we can do a free analysis and figure out what the credits are gonna be, and then we can do a fixed fee based, arrangement. We can do hourly with the capped. I mean, it's usually, it ranges as low as 10%, as high as 30, right? It depends what the credits are. But it's all a matter of how many hours it's gonna take us to do the study. But you're essentially buying $1 for no more than 25 cents, right? And we can firm that up with some numbers. If a firm tells you they're doing it on a true success-based fee for R&D, that's actually illegal. You can't do that. So, we keep track of our hours, and then if let's say we're capped, for example, at 20%, but the hours that we've worked on the study generates a fee that's less than the 20%, then we bill you for the hours, right? So that's how we do it. One important thing on the R&D is that whoever you're working with, make sure they're including audit defense at no additional fees. So if the IRS decides to look at it in a year, 2 years, 5 years, if the firm that did the study didn't include audit defense and they decide to pull you for audit, the burden of proof is on you as a taxpayer, and you basically have to start from scratch, and it's ugly, right? So whoever you're working with, make sure they're including audit defense in their original fee structure. So if it gets pulled for audit, you don't have to pay for that. On the grant side, it's a small retainer that we charge for phase 1 or phase 2, but it's very close to being a success-based arrangement.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? All right. Thanks, guys. Feel free to come by later. Thank you.